we'll go ahead and get started. And several of you have heard presentations from me in the past, so some of these slides are going to look familiar. But I always like to start with what shipwrecks are, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about shipwrecks and underwater archaeology. So I'm going to start there. Maybe my pointer will work for me tonight. So when a lot of people think about shipwrecks and underwater archaeology, it's going to be what they hear or what they think about are things like treasure maps and sunken treasure and Spanish galleons and gold. They hear, or when they think about a shipwreck itself, usually what they think about are things like, not a very good illustration, but a ship that's still standing on the bottom of the seafloor with the masts, still billowing in the wind and still standing, and skeletons and wheels and, all of kind of that big R romance of shipwrecks. And I think a lot of the reason why we think about shipwrecks that way is because of popular culture. It's things we read about in books, things we see in movies and on TV shows. It's also a relic of Florida's very long history of interaction with shipwrecks. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there were a lot of individuals, particularly in South Florida, recovering materials from archaeological shipwrecks, mostly Spanish shipwrecks, because they had things we call valuable on them, things like gold and silver and jewels. But that's really only part of the story, and it skews our idea of what underwater archaeology actually is. So my intro here is just to kind of talk about what underwater archaeology is. So when you think of a shipwreck, maybe you think of those giant ships standing on the bottom of the ocean. But here is what a shipwreck actually looks like. So here's a local shipwreck. This is over, actually it's not in Florida, so I'm going to qualify this. But it's just over the border in Seminole River in Alabama. And this is a steamship that wrecked in that river. And you can see the boiler of that steamship just poking up above the surface of the river. Let me scoot this over a little bit so I can look. So this is what a shipwreck actually looks like. It's going to be finicky on me tonight. It's just the sensor. No, I think I just need to make sure it's hitting in the right spot. Okay, that might be a little bit better. Here is what a shipwreck actually looks like. This is was a wooden shipwreck. This is wrecked in the Florida Keys. You can tell by the color of the water. That's not typically what our water looks like up here in the northern Gulf. And what you're seeing is essentially the ballast pile of the shipwreck, all of the rocks that would have held that ship upright in the water. The wooden part has long been eaten away or blown away by storms, but what we have left is this ballast pile. So this is what a shipwreck looks like. Shipwrecks also look like this in Florida. This is a ship that was washed onto the beach over on the east coast of Florida, on the Atlantic coast, near Ormond Beach. And so what you're seeing here is the very bottom of that shipwreck. The wood has been preserved in that sand over time. So you have this part here, the backbone of the ship, which is the keel, and then all of the frames or the ribs of the ship coming out to the side. So this is what a shipwreck looks like. Shipwrecks also look like this. If you've been in this area for a long time, you may know of the Shields Cove or Shields Point area. It was essentially a ship graveyard. Around the turn of the 20th century, when ships were out of commission, they could no longer be used, they were hauled upriver, up the Blackwater River, and abandoned at Shields Cove. And today, there are about 17 shipwrecks in this area. And if you have a kayak or a boat and you go out boating on the Blackwater River, you can actually snorkel these sites. The water's a little dark, it is the Blackwater River, but it is really fantastic to see all of these old shipwrecks. There's barges, there's schooners, there's tugboats, all kinds of ships there. So these are what shipwrecks actually look like. And so, as archaeologists, we view shipwrecks as clues to the human past, right? Yes, they have artifacts on them. Yes, those artifacts are really cool to see and to touch and to remove from the shipwreck sites, or excavate as we call it. But what's important to us as archaeologists is learning about the human past, learning about how people lived their lives, what they traded across the world, how they navigated, why people went from one place to another place, how people fought wars, how diseases are spread, how language and culture moved around the planet. So really, again, all we're trying to get at is the people through our study of these shipwreck sites. So, shipwrecks are important archaeologically. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of archaeology, which is, looking at tangible remains of the past to learn about people in the past. And when people think about archaeology, typically they think about archaeology on land, digging holes in the ground to find artifacts. We're essentially doing the same thing underwater, but the underwater environment is unique. And it's one of the reasons why I love doing underwater archaeology. On land, people tend to live in the same place over time. If you think about someplace like downtown Pensacola, people have lived in downtown Pensacola for over 300 years continuously. The record of the archaeological record, or these artifacts of the past, get mixed up over time as new buildings are built and demolished. So that can get quite confusing for archaeologists, but underwater, shipwrecks don't tend to wreck on top of each other, right? And so it's more of what we call a closed context, because people don't live underwater. Shipwrecks don't wreck on top of each other. The things that are on an underwater archaeological site tend to stay there, right? Unless there's a big storm event or the ship gets salvaged. But it's what we call a closed context, or a snapshot in time. Another word for it is, of course, the time capsule. And I'll explain some of these images later on in the presentation. But the other great thing about underwater archaeology is that preservation underwater is often very good. Here in Florida, our soil is very acidic on land. And so it's hard for small organic objects to survive for a very long time on land. Underwater, the story can be completely different depending on where that ship wrecks. If a ship wrecks in a very muddy, kind of gooey sediment area, particularly like a place like Pensacola Bay, that shipwreck gets covered up over time, and that sediment creates what we call an anaerobic environment. So basically, there's no oxygen there. And so no tiny organisms can come in and eat away at those potential organic artifacts. I'm thinking of things like bone or food remains. So a good example of that is from one of the shipwrecks we'll talk about here in a second. It's the Manual Point shipwrecks. These are the shipwrecks from the Tristan da Luna fleet of 1559. And so because of where these ships wrecked, which we'll talk about, we find the remains of things as small as black rats. Their teeny tiny bones have been preserved for almost 500 years underwater. Right? We also find things like olive pits and beetle wings. It's incredible to think that those things have been around for as long as they have, but it's because of where they wrecked. We would never find that on land. And so really the big picture is that shipwrecks give us information about the human past. That's why we do the work that we do. It's also important to remember that shipwrecks are non-renewable resources, so when they're impacted, right, we're not going to grow a new Spanish galleon from 1559. Right? These things aren't going to come back. So it's important for us as archaeologists to get the word about our preserving these sites and the artifacts so that they can be shared with all people, now and into the future. And one way to think about this too is, and this is I think increasingly important for us as archaeologists, is to talk about how we can share these sites with other people. And traditionally in the past this has come through diving tourism, but digital technologies are making underwater sites more accessible for other people. So we can create 3D models or share information online and digital exhibits in ways that we couldn't in the past. So shipwrecks, of course, are also important. Biologically, they're underwater ecosystems. As soon as something gets in the water here in Florida, in our sandy coastal waters, especially here in the Northern Gulf, life is immediately attracted to it. So they also become marine ecosystems. Shelter for juvenile fish, they're substrate for invertebrates. All kinds of things grow on these underwater sites. But of course, there are some problems that affect shipwreck sites. I would be remiss if I didn't mention